Hello, everybody, and welcome to the final episode of the Libertines. It's going to be a little bit of a long one today, probably about an hour, because we've got roughly 70 pages to go. I'm sorry if there's any background noise. There's nothing I can do about it, but somebody who lives around here is doing some sort of DIY. Yes, perfect for quarantine. Let me give you a summary of what I think is happening, but as we found in the last section, we feel as a community watching this, I think, that the author has got confused about their own characters. Who I think we found yesterday is, we have Alexo, and he's finally found his dad, who was living in a ruined abbey, with the bones of his dead mother, as you do. We learnt that backstory. And so the dad's with them now, and they're traveling to some place, Aragon, I think, which is somebody's home. And he's with, I think, Alfonso and Clorinda and Cleanthe, that little family. And also Bertram, but Bertram Senior, who used to have another name, but I think is now just Bertram. And his daughter, Amantha, who is Alexo's wife. But it's possible at this point that the author has just made Cleanthe and Amantha into one single person. I don't know. Doing these videos has really made me aware of these issues because of having to do the summaries each day. And it's made me think, wait a second, I'm sure that person was called something different yesterday. Anyway, hopefully it'll all make sense today and we'll get to the end and everything will have its resolution, whether that's tragic, gothically tragic, or happy, a lovely happy closed ending where everybody's jauntering off into the sunset. We have yet to see. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into it. Chapter 10. And the epigraph is from Pope. Thou knowest how guileless first I met thy flame, when love approached me under friendship's name. My fancy formed the evangelic kind, some emanation of the all-beauteous mind. In the enjoyment of a season of happiness, we sometimes forget that life is surrounded by events hid in the womb of time that may one day infallibly destroy our comfort. The Marchioness of Meridas looked not for the morrow and appeared a stranger to anticipation or reflection. Don Castelio, a cavalier of inferior fortune but a friend of the Marquis, was introduced into the castle and resided there as one of the family. On a sudden, his natural vivacity forsook him, and he became fond of retirement, thoughtful and dejected. This unaccountable change in his disposition appeared to create a great degree of alarm in the mind of the Marquis, for he was constantly seen walking with him in the grounds about the castle, apparently in deep and earnest conversation, and usually passed the greater part of the night in Castelio's chamber. The Marquis was suddenly called to Madrid upon important business, and one evening, as the Marchioness was sitting alone in her library, Don Castelio unexpectedly entered the apartment. He presented her with some flowers, and after the usual expressions of politeness had passed between them, and some unimportant observations upon the weather, a mutual silence for some minutes ensued. Castelio at length drew a letter from his pocket, and delivering it to the Marchioness, precipitately quitted the room. She received it with surprise, and opening it, read with the greatest astonishment the following words. It is in vain that I endeavour to endure my sorrows in retirement, when the cause of my distress continues so near to me. Oh, that it were possible for me to forget her. My friendship for Meridas dictates to me the necessity of such a resolution, but I am unable to accomplish it. I respect him, I revere him, but, diabolical thought, cannot resist the cruel desire of sacrificing his happiness to the completion of mine. What an idea. You start and shudder at the sentence, but forgive me, my adored Florella. Forgive me when I declare that I love you to distraction. At this moment, the consciousness of her inability to resist the threats of Castelio, if, in the fury of his misguided and dishonourable passion, he should endeavour to accomplish by stratagem and force what he could not in any way effect by persuasion and flattery, struck her with the most forcible degree of horror. She ordered her servant to sleep in her chamber that night, and the next morning addressed the following note to Castelio. I will not listen to the avowal of a passion that I hold dishonourable and impious. Forget me, and let this affair sink in oblivion. He read it with the severest pangs of disappointment. His affection, as by magic, was changed to disgust and hatred. But as in the height of sorrow he meditated upon revenge, she crossed the great walk in the garden. The fiends of resentment immediately forsook him, fleeing, as it were, before an increased influence of his passion. He followed her hastily through a solitude in the garden, and discovered that she entered a romantic tower near the canal. "Why," he exclaimed, "should I suffer myself to be the dupe of misguided principles? Are the laws of friendship so sacred as to be revered in opposition to the finer feelings of the soul? Oh no. She shall consent." The door was open, and entering the apartment with a cautious step, he had seated himself by her side ere she perceived him. "My God," she exclaimed, as she hastily rose from her seat. "Is it Castillo?" "It is Castillo, and it is the man who adores you. It is he who means to sacrifice his life at your feet if you resist his desires." He took her by the hand and was going to press it to his lips when she forcibly disengaged it and exclaimed in a tone of indignant resentment, "Villain, forbear! Recollect yourself. Are you not the friend of my husband?" "I do confess it. To him I own I am indebted for many trivial favours, but to me he owes his existence. If you love him, you will preserve his life by dividing your affection. There is a secret which, if told abroad, would doom him to instant death. I am in possession of it. He is not the Marquis de la Méridas, but..." At this moment the door was burst open, and the Marquis stood before them. He looked upon Castillo with an angry frown, and taking his wife by the hand, conducted her, almost speechless with horror, to the castle. He there interrogated her with severity respecting the conversation he had overheard, and insisted upon her disclosing to him every circumstance that had happened to her since his absence. She delivered to him Castillo's letter and her answer. A sudden contraction of his brows, together with the paleness which overspread his countenance, were sufficient indication of his feelings. She trembled for the consequences. "I shall return," said he imperiously, "to the castle about sunset." The Marchioness now, for the first time, experienced the most acute sensations of distrust and alarm. The mysterious language of Castillo, the thoughtful appearance of the Marquis, together with the secret conferences which she had observed them hold in unfrequented avenues, convinced her that some matters of importance must soon inevitably be discovered. As she sat pensively at her chamber window, which looked into the garden, she observed Castillo wrapped in his cloak and wandering, as if melancholy, along the borders of a rivulet which flowed near a vista to the canal. As he approached the castle, she heard him say with emphasis, "He will not long interrupt me in the attainment of my wishes. The murder shall be disclosed." At the word murder, she almost sunk upon the floor. "This mystery," she exclaimed, "cannot be long concealed." She had scarce uttered the sentence when the Marquis entered the chamber. Immediately she related to him with unaffected concern what had happened. Her artless questions drew from him the sign of guilt. He turned abruptly from her, and apparently forgetful of his situation, paced up and down the room as one wild with distress, uttering at intervals deep sighs and exclamations of, "Oh God, the villain! I wish I was in my grave!" He desired to be alone that night, and early in the evening retired to rest. About midnight he arose, and arming himself with his sword, quitted his chamber, and proceeded to a gloomy solitude in the grounds of the castle. He there met Castillo by appointment. "Castillo," he exclaimed as he approached him, "is a villain. My confederate and supposed friend. To play the hypocrite is what I never expected. And why this sudden revolution in his character? Can I not account for it? Oh, yes. It is but too true that the adored object of my heart is the talisman which draws forth his damning accusation. But she is proof against the charm. Castillo will find her firmer than Lucretia in the support of chastity. Could he find no other method to bring down the severest penalties of justice on his friend, or to alienate the affections of his wife than by disclosing to the world the murder of the Marquis? Castillo has debased the character of a man by such a thought, and by threatening to publish it to the world, proved himself an inconsiderate and worthless scoundrel, for he was present at the deed, and assisted in the execution of it. I did so, and acknowledged the justice of your reproaches. But have I shared equally with you the reward of your iniquity? Had I not a right to expect a joint distribution of the property we acquired by such an act? Vile dissembler, cried the Marquis as he drew the letter from his pocket. Dare you disavow the real and hellish motives which urged you on to betray me, when I hold such an infallible and damning proof of it in my hand? But mark me, Castelio, from this hour I cancel the bond of our friendship, and so far from fearing your hellish designs, I dare you to the worst. Villain, I do. Beware of my revenge. He hastily quitted the solitude and retired to the castle. Early in the morning, 2 men rapped at the great gate and inquired for the Marquis. They were admitted into his chamber and held a private conference with him for some time. After the departure of the men, he visited the Marchioness and found her in a state of gloomy melancholy. Suspecting the cause to arise from the interruption he had given to the declarations of Castelio, in a moment the horrid fiend of jealousy took possession of his mind, and grasping her by the hand, hurried her to the South Tower and confined her in a room that had not been inhabited for many years. Your adored Castelio shall soon be with you," he exclaimed as he led her into the chamber with a supercilious smile. In vain did she protest her innocence before the face of heaven. In vain did she resist his efforts to leave her with the most piercing entreaties and tears. He thrust her indignantly from his side and closed the door in the violence of his brutal temper. As the darkness of the chamber was faintly illumined by the rays of the sun, which shone through a crevice in the decayed boards that barricaded up the window, objects continually glided before her eyes, and voices as of people in extreme distress seemed to echo along the apartment. Overpowered with the effect of these dreadful sensations, she sunk lifeless upon the floor. She recovered, alas, but to endure torments of the most horrid nature, for as she burst into tears, a faint groan uttered by someone in the apartment pierced her to the very soul. "Gracious God," she exclaimed, "am I not alone?" She listened attentively for some time, expecting by that means to discover from whence the noise proceeded, but a continued silence only ensued. "I am innocent of any crime," she cried, "that can rouse the sleeping dead from the grave. What then have I to fear?" She fancied she heard footsteps ascending the stairs in the tower, and in exploring her way to the door to call for assistance, the groan was repeated. She remained for some time fixed to the spot with sensations almost bordering upon distraction. At length a voice exclaimed, "Oh, Florella, pardon me. Forgive the injuries you have suffered from the hands of your dying husband." At this word, she rent the room with loud and dreadful shrieks and sunk upon the body in a state of insensibility. Alarmed by her cries, the domestics of the castle ran instantly to Castelio's chamber and communicated the circumstance to him. He commanded them to follow him, and they entered the tower with some degree of courage. But when they heard the groans of Gathala, the real name of the Marquis, in a moment the room was deserted by all but Castelio. He proceeded to the chamber, and on opening the door, found the miserable Florella bending over the body of her husband. He seized her by the arm and was dragging her from the tower when he heard old Rigo, the vociferous gardener, and most courageous of the whole household, ascending the stairs, and condemning the dastardly behaviour of his fellow servants in vehement language. Castelio escaped by rushing upon him as he entered the room and extinguishing his lamp. The fellow, however, followed him through the gallery, but unable to come up with him, returned to the kitchen, and relating the circumstance to his fellow servants, desired them to accompany him with lights. They instantly complied with his request, and on opening the door of the tower, with great astonishment discovered their lady weeping by the side of Gathala, who was weltering in his own blood. He was immediately removed to his chamber, and a surgeon sent for to examine his wounds. He pronounced them mortal, and advised him to be attended by a confessor. A father from a convent of white penitents in the neighbourhood was sent for, who, being left alone with him, heard with the utmost astonishment the following declaration. "I lived for some years in the capacity of a confidential servant to the Marquis de la Méridas, who resigned at Strasbourg in Germany. His behaviour to me was more like a father than a master, and upon his accession to his castle and the property of the Alturas family, he appointed me chief superintendent of his affairs. I, by that means, became possessed of his papers, and from them learned that his brother was confined in the Bastille at Paris for some trivial offence, and that his relations lived at the extremity of Andalusia. As he travelled through Germany on our way to Spain, Castelio, a favourite footman of the Marquis, concerted a plan whereby we might possess ourselves for some time of the Marquis's estates. He communicated his designs to me, and I readily accepted the proposal. We frequently travelled through forests during the night for dispatch, and as we rode along the pathway of one of these dreadful solitudes, I suddenly called out to the Marquis to stop, pretending that his horse's shoe was loose. He immediately dismounted. At that instant, he seized him by the throat and strangled him with a whip. This mode of perpetrating the deed was adopted to prevent the clothes being stained with blood, for I was obliged to dress myself in his apparel to personate him with success. After throwing the body into a pit almost filled with stagnated water, we rode furiously through the forest and travelled with the greatest expedition until we arrived at the castle. As the Marquis had never been seen by any of the domestics or the peasantry who lived upon the estate, I was welcomed with great joy and festivity. By a course of reflection, however, I became harassed with the enormity of my crime, and usually spent the greater part of the day in a round of dissipation, and every night retired to rest in a state of intoxication, purposely to avoid the horrors of conscience. Unable to bear the load of guilt which continually oppressed me, I repaired frequently to Madrid in order to avoid reflection. And one day, as I was attending to a procession of nuns that passed through the chapel of the Augustine friars, the uncommon beauty of one of the Vestals struck me with such forcible admiration that I determined to hazard an intrigue with her. I waited the return of the procession, which was about dark, and as it passed under the gloomy porch of the chapel, I contrived to slip into her hand a billet, which contained an avowal of my passion, promises to maintain her in magnificence and wealth, and signed myself the Marquis of Meridas. I pressed on to the gate of the convent, and stationing myself by one of the towers, heard her whisper as she passed, "Go to the south wicket." I immediately flew to the place of rendezvous, and after waiting some considerable time, heard several persons near the door, apparently in earnest conversation. They soon, however, separated, and I waited with great impatience for the expected arrival of my Dulcinea, but no one appeared. At length, however, a billet was thrown over the wall, and on opening it I found it contained a severe censure upon my audacity, and begged I would not interrupt the meditations of a mind devoted to solitude with the false professions of a dissolute passion and licentious ideas. Chagrined in the extreme by this remonstrance, I returned to my lodging and consulted with Castellio upon the step to be pursued. He recommended me to persevere and procure, if possible, an interview. In conducting this plan, we used a variety of artifices without success, but one night, made desperate by long-continued disappointments, I placed myself upon the wall of the garden and observed a light glimmering through the windows of the chapel. Forgetful of so rash a proceeding, I descended into the garden and, tracing my way to the sanctuary, climbed up to one of the casements, and with the greatest pleasure and astonishment discovered the adored object of my love, trimming a lamp at a small sepulchre under the window. Enraptured by this fortunate circumstance, I was about to enter the chapel when she left the place, and with a lighted taper proceeded down a solitary walk in the garden. I overtook her, and extinguishing the light, declared myself to be the person who had addressed the billet to her, that my love was honourable, and if an application to the abbess would not have any effect, I would procure a dispensation from the Pope to release her from her religious obligations. Fear almost overpowered her senses. "The time of prayer," said she, "is nearly arrived, and if I am discovered, inevitable destruction will be the consequence. Permit me to return to the convent now, and I promise to meet you by the South Tower tomorrow night at 12. I embraced her. She struggled with apparent reluctance, but when my lips met hers, she pressed my hand with sympathetic ardour, and wishing me a good night, fled to her cell. I immediately gained the wall, and descending into the street, retired hastily to my lodgings and related the whole adventure to Castellio. The next night I was loitering near the monastery some time before the clock struck 12, and passed away the time in listening to a band of serenaders who were passing under the convent walls. When the long-expected hour arrived, I ascended the wall, and in a few minutes witnessed the appearance of my beloved Florella. St. Anna at that moment rushed between us with a drawn dagger. "St. Anna," uttered the friar with a deep sigh. "You know her then, father?" continued the penitent. "She is the mother of my wife." "Merciful God!" he cried as he sank back in his chair. "Is the beauteous Florella the wife of a murderer?" Gathala remained silent for some time, when the monk, who had recovered from his surprise, desired him to proceed. "I imposed myself upon the abbess for the Marquis of Meridas by means of forged letters from Don Juan de Malena, brother of the Lady Asturias. I could plainly perceive that these testimonials had great weight with her, and pushing on my suit with all the eloquence I was master of, at last obtained her consent to marry her daughter, and the nuptials were celebrated privately at midnight in the chapel belonging to her own convent. The innocence and beauty of my wife soon changed a lawless passion to sincere affection, and we lived in uninterrupted happiness until Castellio became enamoured with her charms, and to eradicate her regard for me threatened to disclose to her the murder of the Marquis. I reproved him for his villainy, and resolving to be revenged upon so perfidious a wretch, hired 2 assassins to murder him at midnight in his bed. But they, in expectation of receiving another reward from him, disclosed the secret, And in the evening, as I wandered in one of the avenues, they came in company with Castellio, and stabbing me in several places, left me for dead in the walk. I laid for some time bleeding on the ground when the ruffians returned, and taking me in their arms, carried me to what is called the haunted chamber in the south tower, and threw me with great violence on the floor. I had, in a fit of jealousy, confined my wife in that chamber. It was a barbarous and inhuman proceeding, but proved a most fortunate circumstance. For on hearing my groans, she drew the servants to the tower by violent shrieks. The villain Castellio accompanied them, and seeing her by my side, he rushed upon her and was dragging her from the chamber when the gardener appeared and prevented him. He has fled the castle, but may yet be lurking about the grounds. Into your paternal care I recommend my beloved Florella. During the conclusion of Gathala's confession, the friar was wrapped in thought, but when the name of Florella was mentioned, he burst into a flood of tears and turned almost frantic to Gathala. You have committed, said he, unpardonable crimes. The comfort I can bestow upon you through the means of religion will be small indeed, but it shall be administered. After he had given him absolution, Gathala inquired particularly for Florella and begged to see her. The friar trembled and persuaded him to the contrary. He rang his bell, however, with great violence, and after a few minutes had elapsed in perfect silence, the sound of footsteps echoed along the gallery. The friar hastily quitted his seat and was proceeding to the door when it opened, and the disconsolate Florella entered the apartment. His face was instantly smothered in his cowl, and passing by her with an agitated step, he gained the gallery, ere he recollected that he had left a book upon the table with his name written at length in the title page. He returned to the chamber when he heard Gathala speak as follows. My life, Florella, is drawing to a close, and to that holy friar I have recommended you for your protection. She burst into tears. I have been foully murdered by Castellio. I am not the real Marquis of Meridas, but practiced that abominable artifice upon your mother and forged letters from Don Juan de Modena to induce her to consent to our union, as I discovered from her own declarations that she had been treated by the Asturias family with more than common respect. He appeared at this moment to be fainting. The friar ran to the bedside, but he was struggling with the agonies of death. For some time he lay speechless and apparently in great torture. When endeavouring to rise in his bed, he fell back upon his pillow and expired in dreadful convulsions. The situation of Florella can better be conceived than described. For such is the character of the female sex in many instances, that although they are oppressed with injuries and treated more like slaves than objects who are entitled to our protection and regard, they continue their attachments with unshaken fidelity, seeking in the hour of distress to ameliorate by attention and sympathy the sufferings of their unwarrantable taskmasters, when neglect and contempt would in such cases deservedly be applied. She continued by the body of her husband until near midnight, when she retired to her chamber. It was the same which had been occupied by St. Anna during her residence at the castle. She sunk upon her couch and endeavoured to obtain a few hours' repose. When she arose, she found the night not far spent. The moonbeams still glittered on the water, and a solemn silence reigned around the castle. She seated herself by the window, and taking her lute, played a favourite little melancholy air, which her mother had taught her in the convent. When she had finished it, she observed the friar under the tower, listening with great attention to her lute, and as he fixed his eyes steadfastly upon the window, she heard him say, "It was that room I first beheld the beautiful and unfortunate St. Anna. What a dreadful gloom now seems to appear in every part of these solitary walks, once the delight of her ingenuous mind. Then it was that I could boast the possession of a tranquil mind, and long had I remained master of that invaluable treasure but for the powerful influence of a vicious passion. Can I meditate in the solitudes without a tear? Can I witness, amidst the deep serenity of the night, objects that were once the care of St. Anna, now wild and neglected, without the heartfelt pangs of horror? How often have I listened to that air, now played by her disconsolate child with unwearied attention? That friendless unfortunate to be the wife of a villain, a murderer. Oh, heavens!" He burst into a flood of tears and retired hastily down the avenue. Surprised at his singular speech, Florella rose from her seat and paced up and down the chamber, wrapped, as it were, in the gloomy anticipation of impending misery. Her tears ceased to flow, and her eyes, apparently with the impulse of insanity, rolled wildly on her head. She stopped at intervals, and with deep sighs exclaimed, "Did he not mention the name of my mother, and with such emphasis and sorrow? Merciful God, it's impossible. Yes, it must be the dream of a bewildered brain." The morning dawned. She saw the friar quit his melancholy haunt and enter the castle. "Go," said she to her servant, "go and request the friar to attend me. If he knows my mother, he cannot refuse in this distressing moment to comfort and protect me." In a few moments he entered the apartment with his face buried in his cowl. "Behold," she cried, "an innocent victim to treachery sinking beneath the weight of her misfortunes. Behold her placed in a situation scarcely credible, without a friend to whom she can apply for advice or consolation. Oh, that my dear affectionate mother could be informed of my situation. In her bosom I should find an asylum from the perils that surrounded me. Yes, St. Anna would protect and comfort me." "St. Anna," exclaimed the monk as he threw back his cowl wild with distress, "I am your protector, your father." "My father? Great God!" She started with violent emotion from her seat and looked upon the pale and almost senseless friar with marks of distrust and horror. "Yes," he continued, "before you stands the depraved and guilty Jerome. Forget those sacred ties by which we are connected, for I am unworthy of them, and look upon me only in the light of a friend." Convulsive sighs burst from her heart, and as he approached to assist her, she swooned in his arms. When she recovered, fearful of being again the object of the friar's unnatural and licentious cruelties, she threw herself upon her knees before him. "Your child requests you," she cried, "to respect the sacred obligations of a parent." "That fatal illusion wounds me to the very soul. My child, before my God do I swear to protect you with a father's love." He pressed her to his bosom, and for some time mingled his tears with those of his unhappy and ill-fated daughter. During the day he left her, to direct some necessary preparations respecting the interment of her husband's body. But in the evening he visited her again, and continued with her until near midnight, when he retired to his chamber. Sleep fled his pillow. The agitation of his mind compelled him to seek comfort in devotion, and stealing softly from the garden, a small oratory dedicated by the Lady Asturias to midnight prayer. He had often during his residence in the family indulged his meditation in this consecrated spot, and as the piercing familiarity with which every object struck him brought back to his imagination that delightful period when his mind, untutored in the vicious artifice of impure ideas, was the seat of unbounded happiness, he wandered to the grotto where he first seduced St. Anna, and taking his pencil from his pocket, wrote a letter to her, expressing of his sorrowful contrition. Early in the morning he ordered the grave to be dug in the small chapel that belonged to the castle, and then retired to console his beloved Florella. The procession commenced at midnight, the glaring of the torches among the old forest trees bending to the wind as they passed on to the grave. The solemn appearance of the bier and the piercing sorrows of Florella struck everyone present with an awful sense of the ceremony. They had nearly reached the oratory, which was illuminated for the purpose, when several voices commanded them to stop and rest the bier upon the ground. Confusion and terror were visible in their countenances, and ere they had time to question each other concerning the cause of this alarm, 4 men habited in long cloaks approached the bier, and throwing aside the pall, forced open the coffin, stripped the body of its shroud, and thrusting it into a large sack, uttered the following words: "The Holy Inquisition is our authority for this act." All now was horror and distress. The friar, regardless of every circumstance that claimed his attention, ran in search of his daughter, whom he found senseless on the ground, surrounded by the female part of the family. He took her in his arms and fled with the greatest precipitation to the castle. On entering the hall, he found it filled with men, armed and dressed in travelling habits. They readily gave him assistance, and entreated him to suffer them to call their master. "Who has usurped," cried the monk, "the dominion of this castle?" At that moment a tall man in rich dress entered the hall, accompanied by a stranger of genteel appearance. He looked sternly at the monk and questioned him concerning Florella, who had just recovered from her indisposition. "She is the unfortunate wife of Gonzalo, the last possessor of this mansion," said he. "Ah, is it possible that so lovely a creature should be the wife of that abandoned villain, the murderer of my brother?" Sorry for the accent. "Brother?" "Yes, Reverend Father. Before you stands the brother of the ill-fated Marquis of Meridas. I have unexpectedly arrived in Spain, on being liberated from the Bastille, where I had been confined for many years for speaking contemptuously of an insignificant and worthless courtier. I hastened to congratulate my brother on his acquisitions, and I I stopped at a small inn in the village of Brego. A man who I was positive I had seen before accosted me by my name, requested to be in private with me for a few minutes. I consented, first promising not to interrupt him in his journey, in consequence of anything he told me. He then related to me the horrid murder of my brother. Accents slipping all over the place, sorry. And the situation of the villain who perpetrated the crime. I begged of him his name, but he refused to tell it. My servants watched him narrowly until midnight, when he suddenly disappeared. I returned to Madrid, and procured officers to seize the murderer, in order that he might expiate his crime upon the scaffold. Florella burst into tears. She was conducted to her chamber and left, attended by a female servant, to seek some refreshment from repose. In the evening she was visited by her father, who told her that Don Volio, the brother of the murdered Marquis, who had come to take possession of the castle, sympathizing with her in her distresses, had promised to send her in his carriage under an escort of 4 faithful domestics to Madrid. Overjoyed at so unexpected, so pleasing an event, she begged that her journey might not be delayed, as the scenes around her served only to increase the melancholy reflection on her unhappy situation. The friar informed Don Volio of her request, and early in the morning of the next day the carriage was in readiness at the gate of the castle. After collecting her little store of valuables and books, she took an affectionate farewell of her father, who gave her a letter to the abbess, and bidding Don Volio a polite adieu, departed, attended by a female servant, for the convent of St. Catherine in Madrid. Jerome continued watching the carriage until it disappeared on the distant hills, when he set off for his convent with a heart too sorrowful and oppressed to be relieved by the gloomy scenes of a cloister. She arrived at the convent in perfect safety, and after presenting the servants with a gratuity for their care and attention, hurried through the cloisters to the parlour and inquired for the abbess. St. Anna entered the apartment with a countenance full of joy. "My daughter," said she, "this unexpected visit is more than I should have thought of." Florella burst into a flood of tears and delivered the letter to her mother. She opened it with a trembling hand, and her undisguised horror at seeing the signature of Jerome compelled her to refrain for a few minutes reading the contents. They were as follows. "This letter, my beloved St. Anna, is written on the very spot where I first seduced your affections under the sacred guise of friendship. Every idea of that crime is attended with an unconquerable degree of sorrow. Accident lately placed me in a situation where the tender attention of a father became requisite for the salvation of our child. Ah, St. Anna, the beautiful Florella has been married to a villain. He proved to be the servant of the Marquis of Meridas, whom he murdered in Germany, and has for some time assumed the title of his master, and been in possession of his property. He deceived you with a letter said to be written by the uncle of the Marquis, but which he forged. He has treated the unhappy Florella with brutal and cruel severity. He now moulders with the dead in the prisons of the Inquisition, and she is returned to claim the protection of, I hope, an indulgent and affectionate mother. Jerome." She felt the consciousness of her temerity in hastening the celebration of a marriage upon such trivial evidence of Gazala's title to the property of the Asturias family, as the production of a few letters from Don Juan de Modena. "I meant not," she exclaimed as she pressed her daughter to her bosom, "your unfortunate situation. I own my indifference was great, my indiscretion was great, but to guard against guilt and insincerity is beyond the ordinary powers of the human mind. I shall ever curse the hour when I resign myself to the fatal influence of pride and credulity." She paused, and in a faltering tone inquired of her daughter to what convent Jerome was banished, and if she ever heard him mention her name. "He is now residing," said she, in a convent of white penitents in Aragon, "and I heard him call upon your name and curse his perfidious conduct towards you in the height of unfeigned distress." "My God," she cried as she sunk into a chair, "what feelings are these? This unusual trembling. My heart palpitates. A sudden coldness steals all over me. I am faint. Assist me, Florella. Oh, Jerome." Didn't see that coming, did you? It was some time before the abbess recovered, when she listened to a narration of her daughter's misfortunes, and considering herself the sole cause of her distress, conjured her to forget her sorrows, and not to dwell upon the remembrance of an ill-fated villainous husband. "He called on God," said she, "to witness the justness of his possessions, and that God has now punished his impious temerity." St. Anna frequently wandered alone among the romantic walks of the garden at the close of day to indulge herself in the pleasing task of reflection. For the letter of Jerome revived the mournful remembrance of her love for him and of interviews almost forgotten. As she perused it, she would frequently exclaim, "Written on the very spot where he first beguiled me with the fair form of friendship. Merciful God! And yet my mind, ever active to resent that base and premeditated injury, cannot now resist the impulse of an unrequited and destructive passion." The misfortunes of Abelard and Eloisa became her constant study, and those hours once devoted to prayer she spent in weeping over their mutual sufferings with the tenderest feeling of sympathy. She now experienced the effect of an erroneous opinion, too frequently entertained by the sex, that the inexorable rigours of a monastic life can finally eradicate the natural sensibility of their being, and that ill usage will compel them to forget that they are fallible. Vain and irrational ideas. She concealed her sensations from the sisterhood, and attended to the concerns of her holy family as usual, but at midnight Eloisa could not repeat with more emphasis than St. Anna, "Tears still are mine, and those I need not spare. Love but demands what else were shed in prayer. No happier task these faded eyes pursue. To read and weep is all they now can do." The vaulted aisles and solitary avenues were alone her chief resort in her leisure hours. Her fondness for Florella increased, and instead of lamenting the villainy of Gathala, she rejoiced in her return to the order. She inspired her with a love for religion, but checked at the same time the growing influence of enthusiasm. She particularly explained to her the origin of religious establishments, the means by which they acquired such fatal influence over mankind, the vicious intercourse carried on between the votaries of both sexes under the mask of religion, and the real and meritorious designs of such institutions. Florella looked upon her situation in a light very different from the generality of the nuns. She justly considered the convent an asylum for the unfortunate, and not as the prison house of religious devotees. St. Anna, too, soon experienced those fatal effects which flow from indulging the pleasing sorrows of returning love. She was seized with a fever, and the mind, unable to free itself from the task of supporting in sickness the heavy load of affliction, yielded to its influence, and she became delirious. After some weeks had elapsed, the abbess recovered, and looking back upon her past conduct with a degree of shame, blushed at the remembrance of her weakness, and endeavoured, although in vain, to recover her wonted character. One evening, as she wandered for the air with Florella in the garden, a letter was brought to her by a sister. She stopped and looked wildly at her daughter, hurried her along with her to the cell. She there, on opening the fatal letter, swooned on her mattress. Florella, struck with horror at the circumstance, examined the letter and found that it came from Jerome. The friar reached his convent during the night, and throwing himself, as he entered his cell, upon his couch, gave himself up to the horrors of his conscience. He had privately studied the religious principles of Luther, and that zealous Protestant being then well known in Italy, Jerome, after signing a violent abjuration of his Catholic opinions, fled from the sect in the night and bent his way towards the confines of France. During his journey, he publicly preached in fields and solitudes the doctrines of Luther, and having gained a few illiterate followers, he commanded them to sign a recantation of their Catholic principles. The news, however, spread abroad, and ere he had reached the foot of the Pyrenees, the familiars of the Inquisition overtook him, and seizing him and his partisans, carried them to the dungeons of that fatal prison. He was instantly recognized with astonishment by Don Medea de Grado. As he questioned him with haughty severity respecting his conduct, the friar proudly exclaimed, "I am a murderer, and when I look back upon the errors of my life, my imagination pictures to me the dreadful punishments that await the guilty, and yet have I received from the hand of a holy and religious friar the consolatory administration of absolution for all my past crimes. He told me to rely upon the faith of his religious benedictions for the salvation of my perjured soul, and yet I am still the prey of tormenting reflections. Is it possible for me to believe that a monk can eradicate or even protract the miseries resulting from my iniquity? Can he wash out with consecrated water the remembrance of those bloody and cruel transactions which I sanctioned and committed under the mask of this holy creed? Decaris and Bessari moulder in their unhallowed graves. Oh God, they died unjustly. Can I forget that these hands forever will appear steeped in their blood, Can I forget my despicable treatment to St. Anna and Florella? Can the precepts of that religion which authorizes its votaries to pursue the system of persecution and indulge themselves with lawless and cruel decrees against innocence and virtue assist the serious meditations of a mind labouring under the horrors of a guilty conscience? Oh no. I have been made a villain by my religion, but cannot find in it the virtuous excellence of oblivion. From this hour, I abjure the creed of our most holy Catholic faith, and through the mediation of our beloved Saviour, implore the mercy of an insulted but all-forgiving God. The sacred law requires that blood should be the price of blood, and whether spilt by the executioner or the criminal will, I hope, if it is possible to be credited, expiate the crime that demands such a dreadful punishment. It is but momentary. My mind is made up to it. Prepare your racks and flames, I fear them not. For I die a martyr to the most abandoned and blasphemous creed of the Catholic faith. Oh, page jump. It is impossible to conceive the astonishment this speech created in the minds of the inquisitors. Jerome, late one of their confederates, convicted of heresy, called forth their severest indignation. He was instantly condemned to die by fire. On hearing his sentence, "Exult, imprisoned soul," he cried as they dragged him to his dungeon, "in the triumph thou hast completed." It was there that he wrote the letter to St. Anna, which contained the following words. "You will, my beloved St. Anna, no doubt hear with surprise that I am now under sentence of death in this damnable inquisition. I have abandoned the precepts of my religion and glory in the act, for I have found more essential comfort in the doctrines of Luther than in midnight prayer and hypocritical sanctity. My crimes are great, but I trust I shall be forgiven. Was I conscious that you would shed one tear for the fate of him who has ever lamented his barbarous conduct towards you, with severe and unfeigned contrition, death would be embraced with tenfold felicity. Tomorrow I am to meet my fate at the stake. The hour is 8 in the evening. When you see the clouds of smoke ascend, the soul of Jerome will be wafted to the throne of heaven, and there only will it shudder at the sentence of the eternal judge. I tremble not at the torments I am about to suffer, but exult in my recantation. Adieu, my St. Anna. Adieu, my beloved Florella, my daughter. Think of me when I am no more, and forget in the remembrance of my sufferings those detested crimes which are the bane of my existence. Adieu. Farewell for ever. Jerome." When St. Anna recovered from her indisposition, she read the letter as one in distraction. "At 8, she exclaimed. "He quits this world for ever?" Tears burst from her eyes as she looked with horror towards the towers of the Inquisition, and, absorbed as it were in the grief, the time passed unnoticed until the fatal hour, when, accidentally turning her eyes to heaven, she saw large columns of smoke ascend and roll horribly amidst the coming gloom of night to the sky. She immediately quitted her cell and ran, shrieking with distress, to a solitude in the garden, where Florella and some of the sisters found her stretched lifeless on the ground. They bore her back to the convent, and with the greatest difficulty restored her to her senses. She sat at her window during the night with her swollen eyes turned towards the prison, and as at intervals the sparks floated in the air where the ashes were removed, she shed 1,000 tears in the anguish of her soul, and from that moment vowed to immure herself no longer in the gloomy ways of the monastery. She looked upon the emblems of idolatry which surrounded her with eyes of horror, and as she mused alone upon the misfortunes of solitude, she wrote the following lines. Reflections in Solitude. Ye time-worn domes, all hallowed and divine, where rays of glory on the virtuous shine. When dire misfortune in my early years doomed me to constant misery and tears, I then impassioned sought your blessed abode, and gave my life a sacrifice to God. But now, when summoned by the taper's light to waste in penitence the hours of night, or hear the death bell tolling sad and slow, the solemn anthem and the voice of woe, no more my mind with bigotry adores these dusky emblems of immortal powers, nor superstition's holy law reveres, but mourns its frailty with unceasing tears. My breaking heart now prompts me to declare 'tis love that guides it from the ways of prayer, and shuns with horror these prophetic glooms, dim walks of death begirt with mouldering tombs. For here pale melancholy oft retires, and youth enslaved in pious dreams expires. Here beauty blooms unseen in dreary shades, haunts that no footstep from the world invades. And wretched orphans with injustice driven to seek for comfort in the thoughts of heaven droop o'er their ills and silently complain. Bewildered victims of the troubled brain say, can the organ's soul-inspiring tones, cold marble statues decked with human bones, load midnight watchings, veils, or friar's grave, heal the deep wound that first affection gave? Oh no. Each awful rite may serve to move the soul to piety. The heart to love will ever yield a fond, endearing slave, till sorrow sinks the victim to the grave. When last I witnessed in the face of heaven a beauteous sister to oblivion given, methought I heard beside the sacred shrine some angel whisper with a voice divine, fly, fly the curse. Thy God will never require the soul's repentance in eternal fire. For one transgression, one unholy deed, by reason sanctioned and by love decreed. And though no father, husband, brother, friend, with deep felt grief thy funeral rites attend, nor yonder aisle where glimmering lamps illume, indulge thy ashes with a indulge thy ashes with a with a sculptured tomb. When the pale moon beams shed its trembling light, and contemplation hails the placid night, beside thy moss-grown grave in lonely dell shall sorrowing sisters in devotion dwell, and mourn beneath the glittering willow's shade that hides the unhallowed spot where thou art laid. Their kindred sufferings as to distant skies, attendant spirits waft their plaintive sighs, and in their airy course aloud proclaim, through heaven's wide way, thy consecrated name. The sisters had now learned the cause of her distress, and fearful her conduct might endanger the moral habits of her sect, or eradicate their love for solitude and celibacy, she determined upon quitting the convent and retiring into Switzerland. Her unconquerable affection for Jerome also required such a step, for the scenes around her only served to heighten the severity of melancholy reflection. Everything being prepared, St. Anna, attempted by the weeping sisterhood, quitted the monastery at midnight, and accompanied by her daughter, travelled with the greatest dispatch until she reached Lausanne. It was in a small romantic village near that town where she fixed her residence. Their cottage was situated at the foot of a mountain covered with the most beautiful shrubs, where she erected an altar sacred to the loves of Abelard and Eloise, and in the remembrance of her own misfortunes found that love once known can never be forgotten. Her attention to the inhabitants soon endeared her to them all, and Florella attracted the notion of the curate, a man not in years, but a Protestant, and of a turn of mind particularly adapted to that of St. Anna. She encouraged his visits by becoming his pupil in religious sentiments, and in a little time succeeded in uniting him to her daughter. To the decline of life, their days were spent in innocent and uninterrupted pleasure, and St. Anna, in the contemplation of Florella's happiness, regretted not the frailty of her nature in youth, nor the indiscreet consumption of her daughter's marriage with Gathala. There you go. Chapter 11, and the epigraph is from Milton. Ye valleys low, where the mild whispers use of shades and wanton winds and gushing brooks, on whose fresh lap the swart flare sparely looks. Sorry, it's a bit damaged. Throw hither all your quaint enamelled eyes, bring the rash primrose that forsaken dies, with cowslips wan that hang their pensive head, and florets of 1,000 hues to strew the laureate hearse where Lycid lies. Sorry, that wasn't great. At the end of the second day's journey, the travellers stopped at a cottage by the roadside and inquired the nearest way to the Chateau de Brun. The peasant directed them up a long and beautiful valley, at the end of which Don Alfonso discovered the garden wall of his villa. Some servants were awaiting his approach, and on their arrival at the gate, ushered the party into the house, where a repast was set before them in a parlour ornamented with descriptive figures, worked in tapestry from the ballads of the most pleasing poets. The house was situated on the top of an eminence that commanded an extensive prospect over the surrounding country, which was beautifully diversified with wood, water, and mountain scenery. Cleanthe would often wander by moonlight with Angelo among the neighbouring romantic wilds to muse upon the picturesque and sublime scenes with which they abounded. And when the evening bird sung sweet in the deepest solitude of the grove, to relieve her mind from melancholy reflections, she turned her thoughts to the study of poetry, an amusement which never fails in producing its effect, whether written under the pressure of sorrow or in the sweet delirium of love, In a part of the ruins, she wrote the following lines. Perchance 'tis here that poor misfortune's child, some beauteous vestal, love's devoted slave, the lingering hours in penitence beguiled, or hopeless found a refuge in the grave. For as I pace this mouldering ruin round, enlivened only by the wild flower's bloom, methinks an hollow and prophetic sound comes awful from some hapless mourner's tomb. Again it whispers, with unhallowed tread, wake not the sacred slumbers of the dead. Spirit, if such thou art, I came not here with steps profane at twilight to invade thy solemn sanctuary or sainted tower, but wander at this dark and pleasing hour in silent solitude's deserted shade to mourn a fate distracting and severe, to ease a heart with misery oppressed, by fortune sorrowed and by love distressed. One evening, as she was taking her accustomed walk in the solitude, a Spanish soldier, apparently worn out with fatigue and in great distress, inquired the nearest way to the Chateau de Bron. Yon pathway, said Cleanthe, leads directly to the house, and passed on. As she returned, Angelo met her in the valley. He took her affectionately by the hand and proceeded some way by her side ere he spoke. Cleanthe, said he, when we survey the world with the eyes of compassion and philanthropy, misfortune should not eradicate that sense of gratitude we owe to our Maker for not placing us in a situation worse than that which we enjoy. If the calamities of this life are such as might force from us the severest reflections, we should recollect that it is but a pilgrimage to those realms of happiness where the tear is wiped away and affliction ceases. Cleanthe grasped his hand and begged him to be brief. My mind, said she, is steeled against the impressions of misfortune, and my heart has almost forgotten its natural sensibility. Your speech, Angelo, seems to be the prelude to some recent calamity. Tell me the worst. What am I to expect? Your brother Jacques, said he, as he burst into tears, is dead. Your mother, afflicted at the I forgot this bit. I'll go back. Your brother Jacques, said he, as he burst into tears, is dead. Your mother, I'm so sorry, afflicted at the unexpected news, fell senseless from her chair, and in the act of raising her from the ground, Alfonso perceived some marks of blood upon the floor. On a minute examination, he found that she had received a dreadful contusion in the back of her head from the fall. She now lies dangerous ill and desires to see you. Cleanthe raised her eyes to heaven and addressed herself to the deity. If it is thy will, O Lord, that I should go down in sorrow to the grave, no murmuring shall mark me for thy displeasure. My tears shall be the sacrifices of my heart upon the altars of piety and resignation. Oh, Angelo, were it possible for me to believe there is an unequal distribution of happiness in this life, I should instance myself as a victim to the Almighty's unmerited wrath. She rested upon his arm, and they proceeded silent and in tears to the villa. On her entering the parlour, she was met by her father. My Cleanthe, he exclaimed as he burst into tears and buried his face in her bosom, you will soon be left without a mother, without a friend, but your disconsolate father. Your brother is no more. His death is confirmed by Bertram, who personates the Spanish soldier and who saw him committed to the grave. Bertram, she shrieked. Merciful God! Where am I? Oh, heavens! My long-lost love, my mother! She sunk into a chair and remained for some time with her eyes fixed on the ground, as if in a state of insensibility. But grief, when it has gained the mastery of the heart, cannot long be concealed. It will either waste itself in a flood of tears or prey upon the mind in melancholy silence. Although her beloved Bertram, whom she had so long been separated from, was by her side, she continued to gaze upon her father with the wildest look of horror, till summoned to her mother's chamber. As she entered the apartment, her steps trembled, and an involuntary dread had nearly deprived her of her senses. Supported by her father, she reached the bedside, but when the curtains were drawn back, and she discovered her mother pale and emaciated, when her eyes glanced upon her dearest friend, and observed the livid languor of death spreading itself over her countenance, when she saw the tears steal down her cheek as she stretched forth her hand to Cleanthe with paternal fondness, she sunk senseless into her father's arms. and for some hours remained in the most violent and distressing convulsions. On her recovery, she desired to see her mother, but Clorinda was no more. She had died during the illness of her daughter. When these awful circumstances were communicated to her, she rushed into the chamber and, throwing herself on the body, bathed it with a flood of tears. "Cruel Providence," she exclaimed, "why was it ordained that I should be the sport of unceasing misery? What have I done to deserve these unparalleled calamities?" She paused, and after gazing wildly upon the corpse for some minutes, addressed herself in fervent prayers to heaven. About the hour of midnight, Bertram, with the domestics who were watching the body, persuaded her to retire to rest, and as they were leading her from the bedside, her father entered the room pale and breathless. He spoke not to anyone, but hurried to the body, kissed it with seeming impassioned pleasure. "My father," said Cleanthe. "My daughter." A burst of sorrow ensued. "I have in my dreams suffered beyond description. I thought your mother came to me as I reposed upon a verdant bank near the ruins where we found Don Angelo, and warned me in a voice of sweetest melody to prepare for death. I rose to clasp her in my arms, but she vanished. The striking of the convent clock roused me from slumber. I fled hither, not knowing where I went. What if these dreadful images that float upon the brain should be realized? What if you should be left an orphan in the world of villainy, exposed to unfeeling censure and contempt?" "Oh God," she exclaimed, "talk not of such distracting events. Let me persuade you to retire to rest. I will do the same. Sleep will be of service to us both." He embraced her affectionately and parted with her at his chamber door. For many days did the miserable Cleanthe visit the chamber and weep over the body of her beloved mother, and when laid in the coffin she dressed it with the sweetest flowers that grew in the solitary wild near the villa. The evening at length arrived when the disconsolate husband and Cleanthe were to follow her mother to the grave. She was buried at her own desire in a solitude of the neighbouring convent garden at the hour of midnight. When the procession reached the gate, a funeral bell was tolling, and the brotherhood waiting in the courtyard to receive it. Some carried in their hands a cross or lighted taper, some strewed fresh-blown flowers upon the ground, whilst a select party ranged themselves on each side of the coffin and sung a melancholy dirge. The following lines were engraved upon a tablet and fixed over her grave. "Stranger, beneath this dewy mould, where early flowers their buds unfold, a mother's ashes rest. With no unholy passion tear the tributes of the vernal year with which the turf is dressed. But here at eve, in lonely wild, with mute affection's sorrowing child, her sacred virtues mourn. Or 'neath yon ancient hallowed yew, with sympathetic tears bedew the moss-grown mouldering urn." It was Don Angelo's intention at some favourable period to revisit the remains of his wife in the sepulchre amongst the ruins. He chose this opportunity of completing his desire, and proposed that Don Alfonso should accompany him. "It will in some measure," said he, "relieve your mind from those melancholy reflections which every day force you into solitude to weep over the memory of the lost Cleanthe. Your grief will continue its severity whilst you remain here, for if you only wander in the garden, the drooping flowers that were planted by her hand shall call forth your compassionate protection. You gaze upon them in tears, you leave them with regret. By travelling, the mind will be relieved, for after having visited the ruins, we will proceed to the Pyrenees." "I never can forget her," said Alfonso, as he clasped his hands together with pious resignation. "For if I shed not my tears at her tomb, or in the solitudes of these beloved scenes where we once roved together, climate and variety cannot root out the sweets of reflection. I call them sweets, Angelo, for there is a secret pleasure in distress which no one but those who have felt it can imagine. But I will accompany you." Previous to the departure of Angelo and Alfonso, Bertram was, by the advice and with the approbation of both parties, married to his Cleanthe, who, anxious to know the subsequent adventures that befell him when Rodrigo tore them asunder in the castle, requested he should relate them. They were as follows. "After that fateful night," said he, "in which we were betrayed to Rodrigo by Dorinda, my mind became the seat of melancholy and despair. For concluding that the villain had stabbed you, I felt a degree of contempt for my existence that almost bordered upon insanity. We travelled all night at a round gallop, and when the morning broke, I found by the conversation of my guides that we were pursuing the high road to France. We stopped for refreshment at the sign of the Golden Eagle in a small village at the foot of the Pyrenees, and there I opened the note which was thrown into my prison by Cortés. The purport of it was this: The two men who are to conduct you on your journey are ignorant of the roads. As soon as the party leave them, make the best of your time and try to escape by stratagem." Although the note did not convey that intelligence which I expected, I fully understood its meaning, and accordingly, when we had crossed the Pyrenees and the party quitted company with my two conductors, I took an opportunity by artful questions to learn whether they were or were not at all acquainted with the route intended to be pursued. They disclaimed all ideas of ignorance, pretending at the same time a perfect knowledge of the French roads and byways of the country. But I discovered by certain whisperings and manoeuvres that they intended to hire a guide at the next village. This gave me great satisfaction. I flattered myself that I might, from the few valuables left in my possession, gain him over to my interest, and by that means make my escape. We arrived at a lone house on some mountains about sunset, and it was there that the intended guide was hired. But the agreement was so secret that I knew nothing of the matter until we were about to depart on our journey. The night was very severe, and although we travelled at a great rate, and my conductors well sheltered from the weather, they grumbled terribly at their occupation. In about an hour after we had quitted the inn, we entered upon a wild and desolate heath. The wind howled mournfully along the waste, and ere we had proceeded a quarter of a mile, one of my attendants fell very ill. We instantly halted, and dismounting, laid the poor fellow half expiring upon the ground. I then, by his conversation, found our guide to be an old Swiss ostler, apparently full of conceit and hypocrisy. "There is a house," he cried, "at a little distance from here. Let me step there for some assistance. The man will die else." The ruffian instantly consented. I feigned great sorrow on account of the sickness of my companion, and pretended to assist him, but as he stood over the body, apparently in terrible agitation, I contrived to slip into the pathway our guide was pursuing, and fled after him with the greatest precipitation. I was enabled to follow him by the reflection of his light and the sound of his horse's feet, and continued so close to him that I could not lose him easily. A light at length darted through a clump of trees, and perceiving the old guide quickening the pace of the animal, I exerted myself in proportion. When he alighted at the door of the hut, he rapped loud and requested admittance. An old man opened the window, and after hearing his tale, readily gave credit to his report, and joined him with a lantern and some cordials. No sooner were they out of hearing than I ventured to rap at the door. An old woman appeared at the window, inquired who I was and my business. I told her that I was a bewildered traveller, and begged to know my nearest way to the next village. She gave me a perplexed description of the pathway I was to pursue, but urged by the terrible idea of again falling into the hands of my conductors, I trusted to my fate and crossed the dreadful wild in the line she pointed out. As the morning broke over the hills, I discovered the village spire, and hastening my steps, gained its entrance before any of the inhabitants was stirring, save a smuggling industrious pawnbroker. To avoid suspicion, I entered his shop and exchanged the clothes on my back for a soldier's jacket and trousers, and having purchased my accoutrements of him, jogged on merrily to a small posado in the centre of the town, where I stopped for refreshment. I had not been in the kitchen long before a servant came to me and said that as I was a Spanish soldier, a gentleman who was dying in the house would be glad to see me. A sudden coldness spread all over me. I thought the villains had discovered me, and took that method to entrap me, but resolving upon a scuffle before I surrendered, I fixed the bayonet on my musket and followed the servant to the sick man's chamber. When I approached near the bed, the curtains were drawn back, and my astonishment is incredible when I beheld your brother Jacques in the arms of death. I desired the servant instantly to quit the room, and made myself known to him. He appeared extremely surprised, but the tear that rolled down his cheek as he grasped me by the hand convinced me how happy he felt in himself in having a friend by him in his last moments. I inquired how he came in France, but he was too weak to tell me. He requested pen, ink, and paper. They were brought him, and he wrote almost unintelligibly that I should find you at the Chateau de Bron in Aragon, to go immediately and report his death, to take everything he possessed and see him properly buried. In about an hour after he had done this, he took me by the hand, and turning himself upon his pillow, expired without a groan. I inquired of the physician who attended him if he knew anything concerning him, but could gain no information from any person respecting the mysterious business. At the end of 3 days, I saw poor Jacques carried to the grave, and after paying the expenses he had incurred at the inn, set out for the kingdom of Aragon. I travelled comfortably and uninterrupted until I arrived in Spain, when, stopping at an inn to take some refreshments, I saw my conductors saddling their horses in the yard. Although it was impossible for them to discover who I was, yet the very knowledge I had of myself caused me to think I looked suspicious, and I trembled every step I took until I had got many miles beyond the village. From that time I happened with no other circumstance of consequence but arrived safe in the kingdom of Aragon. I there inquired for the Chateau de Brun, and being directed the nearest way to it by the peasants, found, as I desired, a reward which sufficiently compensates me for all my troubles and misfortunes. The families of Bertram and Alexo lived in strict friendship, and as they had suffered together in misfortunes, they now shared the blessings of peace and affluence. Whilst Angelo and Alfonso fixed their residence at the foot of the Pyrenees in a solitary village for the purpose of meditation and reflection, for the energy necessary to the performance of great actions, elevations of character, and stability and firmness in virtue is nowhere so easily required as in solitude, and never so efficacious as by religion. Finis! Yep, that's the end of it. A bit of a what just happened at the end there, very speedy. I was reading the subplot there with Bertram, thinking, how is this going to finish? There's only 2 pages to go of the whole novel, and they're tiny tiddly pages. So there you go. Oh, there's an errata list. You might have noticed a couple of more name erratas going on today. I'm sorry I kept laughing. I just think that's one of the funniest deaths in Gothic history, that she falls off a chair. That's it. One faint too much. That's what happens if you keep fainting, ladies and gents and all people. Particularly in the Gothic, of course, it is the ladies who tend to faint over much, but they got their comeuppance in this book at least. Also, who is expecting Saint Jerome to be the romantic love story interest? Not me. It's always Father Jerome. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to comment. I'm looking forward to see what people thought of this one. Is it definitely a wild ride? Crazily unexpected happenings. So yes, and I'll see you next time for more ghost stories this week. Goodbye.